Okay, so I've got a laptop here that I was absolutely hyped for when it was announced. This is the 2023 Asus Zephyrus M16. The reason I was so hyped for this one is because I noticed that Asus had taken a page out of the book of the underappreciated ROG Flow X16 when they redesigned it for this year. They finally gave us 2 RAM slots on a thin laptop, a 3-fan cooling system with a heatsink covering the entire rear of the laptop, a beautiful mini LED display, and in a thin and sleek package. Sure, it's not a 2-in-1 with a touchscreen like the Flow is, but I was hoping that with the inclusion of the RTX 4090, and this super fast Intel CPU, that it might be worth me jumping over to actually making this my main laptop. Well, turns out I was wrong. But how could they mess this up? I mean, look at the specs. Well, they ruined a lot of the things that I wanted to like, but that doesn't mean it's not for everyone. I still think some people will be very happy with this laptop, and I'll explain why throughout the review, so let's get into it. So while I don't have the Zephyrus M16 from last year to compare this to, I can compare it to the Zephyrus G15 and of course the ROG Flow X16. The G15 had the same chassis as the 2022 model of the M16 here, and continues to have the same chassis a year later, while this one gets a nice little redesign. By the way, I'm forever salty over that, Asus. All I asked for was a G16 with an AMD processor, and you ruined it by just renaming the old M16 to G16. Didn't even give the G series AMD this year, or any of these cool new features, but alright, rant over, maybe next year. Anyways, so in the US, with this laptop, you've got a few models to choose from, ranging in the GPUs from RTX 4070 to the absolutely outrageously priced RTX 4090 model. In the US, unfortunately, only the RTX 4090 model has the mini LED display, so prepare to fork over that extra $1,000 for only 10% more performance while you're at it. So these GPUs can run up to 150 watts, but under a load with the CPU working at the same time, it stays around 120 to 130 watts. This is still fairly high wattage for a device this thin, and it's only 25 watts away from the maximum amount that you can pump into a 4090. So huge props to Asus there for pushing the limits on this thing. For the CPU, they all come with an Intel 13900H, which can surprisingly sustain about 110-120 watts of power under a CPU-only load. This is a 14-core CPU with 6 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, all of which you can allocate and park cores right in Armoury Crate. Unfortunately, this CPU doesn't come close to the new HX chips, but we'll talk about that. And being Intel, you can expect lower battery life, lower performance at low wattages, and lower integrated graphics power than its AMD counterpart. But that is all to be expected and not really a surprise. Intel thrives at higher wattages and pushes the limits for peak laptop performance. Okay, so first let's talk design. So much like the Zephyrus G15 and M16 from previous years, you've got just a slight refreshed look from last year's models. Overall, it's in the same aluminum and magnesium alloy hybrid body. I know some people call it plastic, but magnesium alloy is used on quite a few laptops, and although it doesn't feel quite as sturdy as aluminum, it doesn't feel as flimsy as plastic either. So overall, this is a very solid feeling machine. On the hinge, we've got the Ergo Lift hinge here, making a return. This allows for increased airflow as, the hinge lifts up the back of the laptop. But the downside to this though is of course the exhaust has to blow some of the air onto the screen, but I've noticed that most of the exhaust actually comes out the left and right side vents, and to this day I still haven't seen any damage even from 2-3-year-old G15s and M16s. Now I have seen like bad bezel glue application from the factory that might have been an accelerated problem because of the heat, but again, that's a possibility on almost any laptop, and I know this is a big concern for some people, so I just want to ease your concerns a bit, because remember, Asus engineers are spending a crap ton of money on R&D and testing these things to ensure they don't come back with a class action lawsuit in a few years. So they know the limitations of these displays, and they designed that, with this in mind. So it's not something I'm personally worried about. The hinge also used to dig into your thighs pretty bad on the 2021 and 2022 models if you were using it on your lap, but it looks like this year the thickness of this bottom hinge and the feet of the laptop kind of assist each other better. It seems to stay flat a little better on your lap, so that makes it much easier to just, casually browse and use it as an actual laptop from time to time. And another quality of life feature, they moved the status lights further down so they're no longer reflecting onto the screen like they did on previous models, so definitely glad they listened there. And moving on, you now have this glossy strip around the outside of the screen bezel. I think this is a really nice touch, and it definitely adds to the premium feel of the machine. You've got the same super nice dotted design on the lid. Some models like this one here get what they call the anime matrix or anime matrix. This is really just like a neat little array of lights that you can customize on the lid. I know some people think it's gimmicky, and I thought I would too, but I actually found it to be kind of cool. I honestly wish they all had that, and I wish it didn't cost an arm and a leg to acquire those models that do, but if you're not into it, you can disable it anytime in the laptop's built-in software, Armoury Crate. The M16s of years prior had a sort of rubberized coating on the laptop, which is gone this year, and I'm super glad they ditched that because the rubberized coating, not only would it wear really easily over time, but it was also a fingerprint magnet. So luckily the new coating feels a lot like the G15s and does not really attract fingerprints very easily, so that's nice. The keyboard is the same, beautiful centered keyboard that we've been blessed with the past few years on most ROG laptops. It feels amazing to type on, and they give you these shortcut keys at the top for volume, microphone, and opening Armoury Crate, all of which can be customized to do, plenty of other things that you can choose from in the software. You also have your single zone RGB, which can be customized in the software as well. And, I personally just hate numpads like on the Lenovo Legion series. It makes it to where everything is off-centered, and now your speakers have to be downward facing and they sound bad in the process. So, a USB numpad is like $10 on Amazon anyway, so, I'm gonna stop myself before I rant too much, but I get why some people like that. I'm just glad they didn't do it here. And the trackpad is the same beautiful centered trackpad that we've been blessed with again on the past few years of ROG laptops. It's got a great soft click to it, and it's super smooth to use, especially in comparison to plastic trackpads that are commonly found on, like MSI Legion laptops. So, and we've got a 1080p webcam this year. It's just okay, nothing crazy, but it's nice to have, and you can use Windows Hello to sign in super quick with it. As for the charging brick, it's 280 watts and it's fairly compact. I mean, it's about the same size as the 240 watt charger that came with last year's models, so that's pretty nice. This makes it much easier to carry around in a bag compared to something like the huge power supplies from Lenovo and Alienware and MSI. But yeah, overall it's just a really nice design. It weighs a little over 5 pounds, which is a tiny bit heavier than some of the other thin and lights out there, but it's still one of my favorites of any gaming laptop other than maybe like the Razer Blade 15 or the Flow X16. It's super thin, it's sleek, you can take it anywhere, not have to worry about it looking too gamery and getting, weird looks from people. It's just a nice stealthy design, and I wish Asus would adopt this look more with their, Strix and Scar models. That way they at least have one that's like, ultra high performance without being too gamery, but I guess that's too much to ask. All right, so let's talk about the display. So the display I know is going to be a huge selling point for this laptop, and it's incredible. Mini LED is just amazing for gaming laptops. They get way more contrast and brightness than traditional IPS panels because of the active dimming technology, similar to what we've seen in full array local dimming TVs. So, they're not quite as perfect as OLED, but they look shockingly close. And actually they even have a few advantages over OLED because first of all, they get almost like 2 times brighter, and you don't have to worry about any risk of burn-in or image retention. So they're not all perfect though. I made a whole video about mini LED displays that I suggest you watch before buying a laptop like this one. But overall, I think personally, mini LED is my preferred display on a laptop. So first, let me go over the good parts about the display because I have some major issues with it, but I'll get into that in a second. So the one we have here is 240 Hertz with 1024 active dimming zones. That's a great refresh rate and a great number of dimming zones for a mini LED display. I'm going to use last year's 2022 ROG Flow X16 as a baseline for comparison, since that was the first gaming laptop to ever have a high refresh rate mini LED display. That one had half the dimming zones and 165 Hertz instead of 240 Hertz. The color accuracy on both is amazing. You get 100% DCI-P3 and nearly 100% Adobe RGB. So that makes this an excellent laptop for content creators and just people who like colors that pop. And now you finally have an sRGB clamp in Armoury Crate for those who just want a seamless 100% sRGB experience and don't want a widened color gamut. This gives you more technically accurate colors on the desktop or when watching sRGB content, which is a lot outside of HDR. The screen is also rated for 1100 nits peak brightness in HDR, so I measured 600 nits in single zone and around 900 nits in multi-zone, and then of course, when HDR is activated, you get that full 1100 nits. For those of you wondering what single zone means, well, it's only the most game-changing feature to have on a mini LED display that literally no other manufacturer uses, but yeah, I mentioned it in my mini LED video, but basically it means all the dimming zones act as one big one, which greatly enhances color accuracy and gives you even brightness across the entire display. This is amazing and crucial to have, as uneven brightness can really ruin the experience when you're just trying to take notes or read emails, or for content creators who need their content to look how it's actually supposed to look. So I strongly suggest watching that video if you haven't already to get a better understanding, because the last thing you want is to be returning your brand new $4,000 laptop because you didn't realize that mini LEDs create uneven brightness. It's not an Asus bandwagon thing. It's more like a someone please tell these manufacturers to put important features in their laptops kind of thing. Alright, so now on to the issues I have with this display. So, as I've mentioned, less dimming zones typically means less blooming and splotchiness, which is why MacBook Pro mini LED screens look nearly perfect with over 2,000 dimming zones, or at least I thought it was all about the dimming zones before using this laptop. So, the matte coating on this panel, as well as the algorithm used for determining how to activate each zone, actually has a lot to do with it as well, which is why, unfortunately, I like the Flows mini LED display better. I think maybe if I hadn't used the Flows display that I might have really enjoyed this one more, but I can say at least it's given me insight to give better advice on some of the subtleties when it comes to these mini LED panels that some other reviewers might miss. So my biggest issue by far with this display is that dimming algorithm. Despite having double the dimming zones as the 2022 Flow, it actually suffers from much more noticeable blooming. So in these examples, you can see how the halo effect around the cursor is much more noticeable on the M16 than the Flow X16. Now, it's not just the algorithm causing this, but some of this also has to do with the fact that the M16 has a matte screen coating while the X16 has a glossy one. Even the 2023 Flow with the same specs as the M16 here for the display has less noticeable blooming. I much prefer glossy when it comes to displays because, well, it's what MacBooks use and what our phones use, and for good reason. It allows colors and contrast to pop even more since that hazy layer isn't there. That sort of softens things that should be sharper. And with a screen that can get this bright, you really don't need to worry about reflections on a glossy panel as much as you typically would. So I really wish Asus would have gone that route on the M16, but unfortunately they didn't, and now we have this. My next issue with the display lies in the brightness response in HDR, which again, it ties back to the dimming algorithm. So I used my Spider X Pro to run a display assessment here, and it turns out that in HDR, the dimming algorithm causes the squares here that the Spider X normally reads for peak brightness to be artificially dimmed. This does not happen on the 2022 Flow, and you can sort of see it on camera, but you can definitely see it in the results, because I'm getting 1200 nits peak brightness on the Flow and only 600 nits on the M16. The same thing happens on the 2023 Flow X16 as well. And this really sucks for watching HDR content because I'm not sure how much of what's supposed to be paper white is actually being artificially dimmed by this algorithm. In content, I haven't really seemed to notice much of a difference, but still, it's like I can't fully trust this algorithm, and that worries me. So for those reasons alone, I just cannot guarantee that you're going to get the full-blown mini LED experience, and I was super disappointed to find that out. Yes, you're still getting most of the mini LED experience. Don't get me wrong, you're getting insane brightness and colors, but the dimming zone algorithm and the HDR wonkiness here is personally for me a huge turnoff, and likely many others as well, especially when just last year they got it almost perfect on a display that has less dimming zones. And another weird little thing is I found out that running the laptop in Optimus mode for some reason is dimmer than it is to run it in DGPU mode. So I'm not sure why that is, but the dimming algorithm is still just as wonky on each one. Oh yeah, and not to mention the fun little dead pixel that mine came with. Alright, so let's talk ports. So we've got a good selection here. On the right side, we've got USB-A, USB-C port with power delivery, a micro SD card slot. I actually prefer micro SD slots over full size because the card actually goes all the way in the laptop, and that way you can use it as expandable storage if you want, although it isn't the fastest. And on the left, we've got the power input, which has thankfully been moved up to the top instead of like halfway down the chassis like it was on last year's model. And then you've got a Thunderbolt 4 USB-C port with power delivery, HDMI 2.1 3.1 port for 4K 120Hz output, and of course your headphone microphone combo jack. I tested my Thunderbolt 3 NVMe enclosure with a Gen 3 SSD in it, and it did indeed reach the intended Thunderbolt speeds, so that was good to see. But upon investigating the ports, I found another issue with this laptop. So this kind of sucks, but when you're in Advanced Optimus mode, which is like the standard mode that you're normally in on this laptop, both USB-C ports only connect to the iGPU, the integrated graphics, and not your Nvidia graphics. This is the weirdest thing to me because it's not really intuitive. I'm not sure if it's a limitation of Advanced Optimus or Intel or just a decision by Asus, but I'm really not a fan of that. Like for example, on my Flow X16, if I'm in hybrid mode, I can just hook up to an external monitor through either the HDMI or USB-C port, and that will bypass Nvidia Optimus, and that allows for full power from the RTX GPU, and I can simply unplug and still get great battery life without having to worry about a restart. That's the thing, it's like my frustration is because Advanced Optimus is supposed to save you time from restarting every time you want to switch which GPU your display runs through. So it's weird to me that it forces your external displays to run through the integrated graphics, even if you've selected Nvidia GPU in Advanced Optimus. So that means lower performance when you're on an external monitor, especially in high FPS games like CSGO. So say you've selected DGPU mode already, or maybe you're in Optimus because you just got done taking notes on battery, and now you want to plug your monitor in for some gaming on a bigger screen. Well, guess what? If you actually want to run these games through the discrete graphics, you're going to have to do a full restart into Ultimate mode in Armoury Crate. What that does is it disables Optimus manually, including Advanced Optimus. And for some reason, that is the only way to allow your ports, including HDMI, to run any sort of monitor through your RTX graphics and not through Intel, which makes no sense. And HDMI is an even weirder case. So if you're in standard Advanced Optimus mode and you plug an external monitor into your HDMI port, you get some additional options in Nvidia control panel that you would normally see from being in discrete mode, but there's no G-Sync and it reports that you're still in Optimus mode. Yet at the same time, it acts like the HDMI is running through the Nvidia GPU, which makes no sense. What's even weirder is that it causes a much worse decrease in performance for some reason too. Now in Eco mode, which completely disables the RTX GPU, plugging in the HDMI port does absolutely nothing. You get absolutely no output from HDMI in Eco mode, unlike previous laptops from Asus. This really sucks for those of us who might be on battery, needing as much battery life as possible, but we also need to hook up to an external monitor. Well, now you just simply cannot do that over HDMI. In Ultimate mode is where you finally get that HDMI 2.1 experience, with the connection finally going straight through the GPU instead of the integrated graphics. It just sucks that you have to do a full restart to get this to work when theoretically Advanced Optimus should have been able to handle this for you. So the worst thing about this whole port thing is for people that just don't understand Nvidia Optimus very well. So imagine you buy this laptop and you just plug it into your monitor expecting great performance, as you should, but instead your FPS gets cut down. And if you plug it into an HDMI monitor, your FPS gets cut way down. Like, that is unsettling. And if people don't know how to handle these things, maybe they don't know they need to switch to the Ultimate mode to get around this, like that's going to lead to a pretty bad time for consumers. So I'm really not sure why Asus did this. Anyways, moving on to the speakers. So the speakers on this are actually really good for a gaming laptop. I always applaud Asus for putting great speakers in these machines when so many out there just are not that great. You get Dolby Access, which allows you to customize the sound and get the most out of your speakers. These are just really punchy and offer some decent volume too. Here's a comparison with other Asus laptops. Alright, so the insides. So opening this laptop was a huge pain. You have to remove a bunch of screws as well as some that are hidden under the back foot of the laptop, which is only held in place by some adhesive, and I don't know why they did that, but yeah, don't recommend doing this often. So inside, you've got two replaceable DDR5 RAM slots, which is awesome to see in a laptop this thin, and that was not a thing on last year's model. So last year, you only had one replaceable RAM slot while the other one was soldered to the motherboard. You also get a 2TB Gen 4 SSD and another open slot to add an extra one if you want to upgrade your storage space. Here's the speed of the included SSD, which is really good speeds. Unlike some other laptops, which lower the speed when you unplug to conserve battery, this one still runs at full speed whether the laptop is plugged in or not. Not Not sure if that's a good thing. I guess it depends on the person. Here's your Intel Wi-Fi card, which is swappable, as well as your 90 watt hour battery. And then you've got this unique cooling system here, which originally came from the Flow X16, and it did really well. First of all, you've got thermal grizzly liquid metal on the CPU. You've got several heat pipes going across, which are decently sized. And then you've got this unique fan setup here. The fans have variable thickness on the blades for more efficiency. And the crazy part is you got 3 of them. They put a dedicated third fan just for sending more airflow through the center to keep everything cooled better. So this supposedly reduces fan noise from the other 2, but I'll talk about that later. And then you've got the entire rear of the laptop dedicated to cooling. This is just a giant heat sink. And I think as a whole, they've done a really good job, which I'll show later on. There's also some other subtle differences between this and like that of the Flow, which you can see in the back panel. Asus kind of changes their rear panels a little bit on each laptop and even each year, but overall this one you can tell is made to keep dust out and reduce flex. All right, so let's talk software. So, I always start by, first step, uninstall McAfee, update Armoury Crate, Windows updates, download Intel Support Assistant to update Intel drivers, update everything in my Asus, including the BIOS, update everything in the Microsoft Store, get the latest updates from Nvidia GeForce, and now we're good to go. And don't forget the Windows Update Show and Hide tool, because Windows Update always tries to auto-install older graphics drivers because it's Windows. So going through Armoury Crate, let's start with the power profiles here. So you've got Windows, which is, of course, just lines up with whatever Windows power plan you've got set up in control panel. And of course, you can see some of the Armoury Crate profiles in there already. Silent mode limits power to keep everything as close to 0 decibels as possible. Most of the time, the fans do not kick on in this profile, which is really nice if you're in like a library or something. Performance mode is kind of like the balanced mode of this laptop. It gives you pretty good performance, but of course, not your peak performance. And then turbo obviously will ramp the fans up, but it will give you the most performance possible. And then of course you have your manual mode here, which is probably one of the best out there compared to most other laptop softwares. You have control over your short-term power limit, your long-term power limit. You got fan curves for the CPU and GPU here. On the GPU, you have a little bit of overclocking settings, which for some reason maxes out at 50 megahertz offset and 100 megahertz memory offset, which is really low, but that's for some reason exclusive on the M16. Other Asus devices usually max out around 150 clock and like 300 memory or higher, but you can adjust this yourself in third-party software like MSI Afterburner, where you can obviously go way beyond those limits. You've got a dynamic boost slider here, which is what allows your GPU to go from 125 to 150 watts, and you turn that down, it's going to prioritize the CPU more. And then of course you got your thermal target, which is like your thermal throttle limit on the GPU. You lower that, it's going to lower performance a little bit. And then the third fan has its own curve here, the system fan, which is really nice as well. New to the 2023 models, you have your CPU core parking. You can choose how many performance cores you want and how many efficiency cores you want. You can disable every efficiency core if you want, and you can go down to 4 performance cores. This is just something that you can play around with because, it doesn't always have a huge benefit, but it can reduce how much power the CPU uses if you're trying to keep things a little more tame. The enemy matrix is right here in Armoury Crate. You can change the effects that are happening on the lid right here, and you can even design your own, or you can download more, and you can do all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Of course, it has their own settings like power saving, whether to keep it on when the lid is closed and things like that. You've got the virtual pet, which I don't even know what this is for, but Asus loves to do little gimmicky things like this. And, of course, your system configuration panel where you can disable the Windows key, disable the touchpad, disable that god-awful boot up sound. You can turn panel overdrive on and off. You can turn panel power saver on and off, which what that does is when you unplug the laptop, it automatically lowers the refresh rate to save battery. And then of course you have, like I've talked about, the single zone and multi-zone backlight control, which like I said is a real game changer for content creators and people that are just, browsing, emailing, things like that. It helps keep a uniform brightness across the whole screen. Then of course you have your mux switch controls here. So standard is Advanced Optimus. On this laptop, you really can leave it here most of the time because Advanced Optimus automatically switches to DGPU or Optimus depending on what you're doing. You can even manually change it in Nvidia control panel without having to restart. Ultimate is if you want to just do DGPU only no matter what. This disables Advanced Optimus, of course. So if you unplug, you're not going to get great battery life. But for those of you who leave it plugged in all the time, maybe you want this because of course it's going to give you the highest performance at all times, no matter what. I always turn on the option to control the GPU from the system tray right here in Nvidia control panel. Definitely recommend that if you keep it in Advanced Optimus mode. Other things you have here are eco mode, which disables the RTX GPU completely, which you'll see happen in the corner here. It just vanishes. This is awesome for when you want to just conserve as much battery as possible and you don't want to wake up the GPU no matter what you're doing. So what that means is it runs everything through the Intel integrated graphics. And then last but not least, you have optimize, which basically it just automatically switches to eco mode when you unplug and then switches back when you plug back in. And you've got some other little settings here. Memory, you can free up whatever's using memory. You can disable anything that's using the GPU. You can customize the hotkeys on the top of the keyboard with a variety of functions. You can control your keyboard lighting. You can control the microphone effects. A cool new feature here is Modern Standby Assistant. This is great to see Asus standing up to Windows' awful Modern Standby, which Linus Tech Tips has talked about. But basically what this does, and you might have noticed this before, if you've had any Windows laptop, sometimes they fail to go to sleep when you close the lid and you wake up to an almost dead, super hot laptop. So Asus did a great job here by basically forcing the laptop into Modern Standby once it detects that you've closed the lid. And then you've got RO Sync if you want some more complex lighting options. Game Visual is where you can use your sRGB clamp or any other sort of color gamut clamp. You can also adjust color temperature, things like that, or calibrate the screen right in Armoury Crate if you have an X-Rite calibrator. Then it's got other features like, game library, scenario profiles, which allow you to make certain actions trigger when you perform a certain action. So, you can have something like your volume turn all the way to 100% when you open a certain program. And then, news and deals aren't that important, but you've got settings here for updating and changing your theme. So definitely recommend checking for updates occasionally. Just make sure you're not missing out on anything. And having Intel integrated graphics, you have Intel Graphics Command Center here, which is mostly just for checking for iGPU updates. But it does have some, color options, things like that as well, if you want to mess with that. Then you got Intel Arc Control, which I guess goes hand in hand with the Graphics Command Center. I think it's more useful actually for people that have an Arc dedicated GPU, but it's probably safe to uninstall this one if you don't need it. Then of course, Nvidia Control Panel, which you'll notice has different options depending on whether you're in Optimus mode or DGPU mode. So you can check right here which one you're in, what your display is connected to. You'll notice in DGPU mode, that's when you have your settings for G-Sync and things like that. And of course, Nvidia's own color correction tools. Moving on to the BIOS, there's nothing really too crazy here, nothing like how MSI laptops give you tons of customizability. You just have some standard settings like the mux switch. A lot of these things you can actually already do in Armoury Crate, but I'll just quickly scrub through the BIOS settings here just so you can see. So let's talk performance. First, we're going to start with the CPU. So as far as the CPU, we've got a 13th gen Intel processor, so it's going to do great. But unfortunately, the 13900H is not much different than the 12900H and is absolutely destroyed by Intel's HX chips this year. That doesn't make it bad by any means, but you're looking at a Cinebench score of just over 19,000, single core just over 2,000. The score doesn't really change much whether you're doing a 10-minute or a single run, which means it's not throttling too much, if at all. I'm looking at the graphs after short boost ends, it stays pretty consistently high at 110 watts and like high 80s in temperatures throughout the stress test. And remember, Cinebench is a stress test. The score puts it about 22% higher in CPU performance compared to the Ryzen 9 6900HS in last year's ROG Flow X16. Like I said, these HX CPUs out here though are doing so much better, hitting scores upwards of like 33,000. And of course, the top dog Ryzen chips this year are also hitting those numbers, which makes this one seem a bit less impressive. And here's the Geekbench scores for the CPU for those interested. All right, now let's talk creator benchmarks. So first of all, latency mon is not looking great here, thanks to Nvidia, which is about average when looking at pretty much every 2022 and 2023 laptop. You can improve things a little bit though by making sure you're in hybrid or eco mode. For Adobe Photoshop, we're getting a Puget score of 1237, which for comparison, the Flow X16 with 3070 Ti, that's about 150 points higher. So not too awesome, but a good score regardless. For Adobe Premiere Pro, we've got a pretty massive score of 1312, which again, comparing to the Flow, is almost double at almost 600 points higher. So Premiere Pro is definitely seeing a benefit from the Intel and the RTX 4090 here. And I'm also going to run a music production benchmark. I have Ableton Live running the included demo session within the software, and we're just going to see how high the CPU load gets, as that's a good indicator of how it's going to perform when you have dozens of tracks with lots of effects going. So it hits about 15 to 17% in the heaviest part of this track, which is great compared to my Flow X16, which hits about 28% here. That shows that the Intel processor is helping quite a bit in music production, even though both are obviously still performing really well. Overall, this is an excellent machine for creators and even scores really well on battery power too, which we'll discuss in a second. So yeah, I want to talk about that before I talk about battery life in general, because I just want to showcase how this thing performs on battery power when we unplug, because most people expect a huge drop off, but that isn't always the case with gaming laptops. Some are much better than others, and this one is actually not bad at all when it's unplugged. Intel laptops usually struggle in this department, but on battery, you're still getting about 70% of the same CPU performance in Cinebench with a score of 13,000. And if you want it completely silent in silent mode, it scores 10,000. So this maintains that 20% lead over last year's Ryzen models, in this case with the Flow hitting about 11,600 in performance mode and 8,200 in silent mode on battery, whereas most Intel laptops actually fall behind Ryzen in these use cases. Our Photoshop score only drops from 1237 to 1040, which is about how the Flow performs while it's plugged in. So another 200 point drop in silent mode. And then on Premiere Pro, when we unplug, we drop to 839 in performance mode and about 700 in silent mode, which is still about 40% more performance on battery than the Flow. And I praise that thing for how good it is on battery. Now, when gaming on battery, this is what you're looking at. So performance mode is very playable around, RTX 3060 laptop levels. And then silent mode scores even higher on the GPU, but cuts back on the CPU a bit. So that puts this one almost at RTX 3070 levels of performance while on battery, which is just nuts. I mean, in fact, silent mode performs better on battery than it does plugged in, but I'll get to that in a second. And then of course there's eco mode, which uses the least amount of power as you're gaming on the integrated graphics, which kind of suck compared to AMD's RDNA graphics, but so just don't really expect anything heavy to be playable here. But overall, these are some of the best results on battery that I've tested. And you can see how this translates to a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider. You can get about 80 FPS on battery at QHD max settings in this game. Sure, you'll only get like an hour of playtime before it dies, so that's almost more than a lot of gaming laptops get while they're plugged in. So that is just an insane result. For reference, the Flow X16 gets about 50 FPS in this on battery in the same benchmark. I also ran Time Spy with a USB-C 100-watt charger plugged in for those of you curious, and it did really well while not really losing any battery at all. I think in the performance profile, it lost like 1% throughout like a 3-4 minute benchmark, so that was good to see. Silent mode didn't really seem to discharge any battery while still performing amazingly and being super quiet, so USB-C gaming is very possible on this laptop. All right, so now let's talk about how long the battery lasts. So I was actually pleasantly surprised with this Intel CPU. Usually they fall way behind Ryzen laptops. And yes, it's not going to get you quite as good of results as a Ryzen laptop would. And the mini LED screen does hurt the battery life a little bit, but overall it's not bad. In my standard YouTube playback test, I got around 6 hours each time, and you can maybe squeeze out, maybe an extra 30 minutes to an hour if you do some other little tweaks, like panel power saver, because remember, a 240 hertz panel does use a little bit more energy compared to what we had last year, which was much more common, the 165 hertz panels. All right, so I have to talk about the fan noise here. The fans on this machine are not tuned nearly as well as pretty much every other Asus laptop that I've used in the past. And that was super disappointing to me. I'm going to start at the quietest profile and go up from there. So the silent profile here is pretty whack. The GPU performance gets cut way back, yet it still hits about 38 decibels in games, which is pretty quiet, but I feel like it should be giving us much more for that amount of noise on a 4090 laptop. And in daily tasks like browsing, I found that silent mode will occasionally ramp the fans up for a few seconds and then come back down, which is pretty odd behavior compared to almost every other Asus laptop that I've used, which normally will stay dead silent in silent mode. Like the Flow X16, for example, dead silent, but if you're doing something intensive, the fans will just barely turn on. The M16, however, does this occasional pulsing, and it's really annoying. For that reason, I would not personally be comfortable taking it somewhere quiet like a library. Moving on to performance mode. The performance mode is a little loud at 47 decibels. That's about as loud as my Flow X16 gets in turbo, to give a comparison, but at least this mode does still offer some pretty good performance. And then I need to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is turbo mode. This is the loudest laptop in its highest performance mode that I've ever tested. At a whopping over 56 decibels, this thing is annoyingly loud. I can hear this thing from the other side of my apartment, and thinking about the way decibels scale, we're talking about double the perceived volume going from performance to turbo mode, and a 10 times increase in sound intensity. That is like just completely unnecessary to me, and I really hate that they did this, and you'll see why I really hate it in a second when I talk about manual mode. So manual mode, with fans manually maxed out at the highest they can go, all sliders set to max, is actually quieter than turbo, like way quieter. It runs about 50 decibels, which is what I'm typically used to in Asus laptops in their turbo mode. And the worst part is that it actually performs a little better too while in this mode, while running quieter and having no noticeable change in temperatures other than maybe like 4 degrees on the GPU. So yeah, this fan tuning is just really weird. They killed it on the hardware, but the software components of this laptop just keep stacking up to be more disadvantages that hold this laptop back. So just remember, if you get this thing, to just game on manual mode for the sake of everyone else in your house. I just really expected more here since this laptop has the same thermal design as the ROG Flow X16, yet the Flow stays way quieter in all of its performance modes. And to illustrate fan noise a little better, I made a TimeSpy graphics score to fan noise ratio chart. So what this is basically for each decibel of fan noise, how many points you get in TimeSpy graphics. So as you can see here, manual mode on the M16 offers a pretty big jump at 50 decibels, 386 points per decibel. The 4090 is really doing all the work there because, my previous best is the Flow X16, which you can see is 47 decibels is where it maxes out at. So even though it doesn't get as much performance per decibel, being a 4070, that one, the Alienware M15 R7, and last year's Flow X16 are all getting, 46 to 47 decibels of fan noise at their maximum performance profiles. And then, in performance, the Zephyrus M16 still leads the charts, but not by quite as high of a margin, 46 decibels here, while the Flow X16 is hitting like 43. The Alienware M15 R7 is the loudest one here in its balance profile, but still offered pretty good results. And then the Blade 15 was actually the most impressive to me, hitting sub 40 while still offering great performance. And then in silent mode, now you can see the M16 fall to the bottom, 37 decibels. It cuts performance way back on the GPU. This is where laptops like the Blade 15, Flow X16 really thrive. So just keep that in mind with this laptop. All right, next we're going to talk thermals. So thermals in a chassis this thin and light are never going to be the best, and they're not, but they are acceptable and nothing that I wouldn't expect. So in games like Apex Legends here, the CPU stays, pretty warm around 85 to 95 degrees, but it's running at a constant 50, 60 plus watts. So that's not bad considering that. And of course, it's within spec. The GPU doesn't really seem to go over 80 degrees in manual, so it kind of hovers around 76 in turbo. Just remember, turbo is a lot louder for some reason, and personally, I don't think it's worth the extra 4-degree reduction in GPU temperature while the CPU stays mostly the same. So we've talked CPU performance. Now let's talk about the GPU. So obviously this is the top of the line RTX 4090 with 16 gigabytes of VRAM running at 150 watts, which is only 25 less watts than the maximum allowed. So, despite what we all think about Nvidia's naming scheme and adding an extra GPU that drove prices up in laptops across the board, this thing offers some insane performance. Like way more performance than I personally saw coming when it was first announced. The only thing is, of course, it's not the top of the line compared to other 4090s. I thought that only 25 watts behind wouldn't matter too much here, but it actually does, and I'll show that in a second. Obviously, this is a thin and light laptop though, so the fact that there's even a 150 watt 4090 in the first place is a real treat. So here's the TimeSpy score, and you can see that this thing clearly blows everything else I've ever tested out of the water. Over 19,000 graphics score in TimeSpy is just incredible to see in a machine this small, and it really is killing it here. But if we look at some of the other 175 watt 4090s out there, they're getting almost 22,000 or even higher in TimeSpy. So with the way this GPU scales, it is definitely hungry for more power. But there's obviously a lot more to a laptop than how it benchmarks, and I would say the M16 makes up for the slightly lower score in the amount of portability and the display that it provides. And then of course here's our Geekbench GPU results for those interested. Alright, so gaming benchmarks. We want to see how this thing performs, of course. So I actually ran most of these in manual mode, which is actually identical to turbo mode, but a little bit quieter and actually pushes the GPU to get closer to 150 watts more often. Both turbo and manual have a super small stock overclock of plus 50 core, so that's not going to make too much of a difference, but let's look at how this thing performs in games. But yeah, just to show you some TimeSpy scores and the different power profiles. So on this chart here, you have the total score, and then the little orange bars are the fan noise in that profile. So So the Zephyrus M16 here, of course, is killing it in turbo mode. In its performance mode, it's still doing great, beating out a lot of other laptops I've tested in their turbo mode. And then silent mode cuts it way back, and it's actually near the bottom of the chart, which is crazy. All right, coming back to gaming performance, so we're going to start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is like my favorite benchmark, my tried and true. I do include some laptops from Jared's Tech, which I'll mark in green on this graph. We're on the highest preset, 1440p. The Zephyrus M16 here is just killing it, way ahead of anything else I've ever tested. It's hard to even compare it to anything else right now until I start testing some more, 4080, 4090 laptops. But you can see, even the 4070 is just so much further behind. It's crazy. Drop it down to 1080p. We're relying more on the CPU now, but it is still scoring a lot better than even, the strict Scar 15 with a 3080 Ti from last year. So great job. 182 FPS. That's a great result. Horizon Zero Dawn is another great benchmark. We're running the ultimate quality preset, 1440p. Again, it's pretty far ahead of anything from last year or the year before, although it is still pretty crazy to see some 3080s from 2 years ago, being under it. Even though they're far behind, still it's like over 100 FPS still, while you can see the 4070 is quite a ways back. Drop it down to 1080p. We're still pretty far ahead in this one with, almost a 30 FPS lead, even from 3080 Ti's from last year. Cyberpunk, I ran at a few different settings. We're going to start with the RT Ultra setting. It actually did not have too much of a lead here over last year's 3080 Ti laptops. Only 10 FPS ahead of the Alienware M15 R7, which I thought was really weird, but it does have the advantage though, however, of using frame generation, DLSS 3, which gets the score way up to 123 FPS. Just to put that in perspective, that puts it at double the FPS as the 3080 Ti from last year. If instead we turn ray tracing off and we're on the Ultra preset, we're getting 91 FPS compared to 63 FPS from the 4070 on the Flow. So almost a 30 FPS gain there. Definitely leads the charts a lot more in this setting. And then if we drop it down to the high preset, we're at 109 FPS, which isn't super far ahead of the Flow's 4070 here, but still a super impressive result, especially compared to laptops from last year. Red Dead Redemption 2, we ran with the favor quality slider maxed out, DirectX 12, 1440p, a huge lead in the charts on this one, 97 FPS. That's almost 30 FPS over some 3080 Ti's, a great result to see. Drop it down to 1080p, we're hitting 118 FPS, another great result. It does really kill it in games. Now, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, this is the extreme settings preset, running the in-game benchmark at 1440p. We're getting 109 FPS here, which is a great result. If we turn DLSS on, we're now getting 138 FPS, which is about 40 FPS higher than you can get from an RTX 4070. Now, Control's a really GPU heavy game. This one, it's getting 70 FPS, which gives it a really nice lead over some of these other laptops from last year. If we turn on DLSS, still a great result, 103 FPS, and that is awesome to see. Now, CSGO is more CPU bound, so we're not going to see as huge of a difference here, but at 1440p, it's at 506 FPS, which is still a good lead. Drop it down to 1080p, and I was actually surprised to see it got more of a lead in 1080p, but 626 FPS. And then lastly, we have Apex Legends. Gets about 200 FPS average. 1% lows are 126, which is crazy to see that the 1% lows are pretty close to the maximum FPS that other laptops got from last year. Okay, so my final thoughts on the Zephyrus M16. So there's a lot of good laptops this year, and this one is no exception. Asus is giving us a nearly full-powered RTX 4090 in a really thin and light chassis that looks sleek and has one of the most beautiful and bright displays that you can get in a laptop. I still think the mini LED display is one of the best screens out there, especially for watching HDR content or playing games in HDR. This gives it a significant advantage over some of the other 16-inch laptops out there like the Alienware M16, X16, Lenovo Legion 7, and others like those, because normally you could only get the top spec in those sorts of bulkier machines, but here you're getting almost the same performance with an amazing display and in a much smaller package. And some really cool little features. There's a lot to love about this laptop. I prefer the build quality on this to some other laptops. It has a great keyboard, amazing glass trackpad, thermals are good. So in my opinion, for the price that it is in the US at least, I'd say it's one of the best laptops out there, and I really love the new features that Asus provided, like parking cores and Armoury crate, modern standby assist, you've got multi-zone backlight control, sRGB color gamut clamp, the anime matrix is pretty cool. All that stuff is awesome, but I cannot ignore the issues, even though I know that they won't bother everyone. First, the fans, the pulsing fans in silent mode, the extremely loud turbo mode that isn't tuned well at all, And sure, manual mode is a better alternative, but it's still not great because having to manually adjust your fan curves when they shouldn't get that loud in the first place is a pretty annoying workaround. Asus just really messed up the fan tuning here, and even some of the power profile tuning with the silent mode getting awful GPU performance, so I really hope they fix that in a later update. You know, the next thing I can't get past is the ports and how they react differently to an external monitor being plugged in depending on the mux switch. I much prefer other Asus laptops that have one USB-C port tied to the DGPU while the other is tied to the iGPU. That just makes it easy to remember. You know, one is good for battery life and one is for peak performance. But now you have to restart, or if you don't understand NVIDIA Optimus, then you could be in for a really rough time when using a monitor. And then of course there's the display blooming thanks to the coding and the dimming algorithm on this. I just can't understand how a laptop with double the dimming zones as my Flow X16 from last year has more noticeable blooming across the board. Like, that just should not happen. So it should look better, but here I am enjoying last year's mini LED panel much more. So despite those things, like if you don't plug into an external monitor at all or not very often, and you don't care about fan noise and you don't mind some blooming on the display, then honestly, this is probably the laptop for you because you're really not going to find anything else like it out there with this many features. I know a lot of people have looked into the Blade 16 as an alternative, but remember, this thing is lighter. It's got a QHD panel, which is the sweet spot at this size and allows for more FPS in games compared to the 4090 Blade's 4K panel with the kind of blurry 1080p switch. The M16 also has this single zone backlight control, color gamut clamp, fan curves, better keyboard, and quite a bit more over the Blade. So I will admit the Blade 16 looks amazing this year though. I'm not discounting that laptop, it's still great. But yeah, I mean, there you have it. We've got an excellent upgrade to the previous Zephyrus M16s, which also stands as a huge upgrade over this year's G16, and I'm still salty about that, but it does have some weird software and tuning issues that hold it back. It's not perfect, but it might be perfect for you. Anyways, thanks again so much guys for watching. I hope that you will leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit that bell. Let me know what you thought of this, what other laptops you want to see, which ones you're curious about, and see you in the next one.